Well, Ecclesiastes, it's an examination of life under the sun. You would have noticed that phrase used a couple of times there, under the sun. And so what it is, it's a book that's asking, what can we discover about the meaning of life when we just begin with ourselves? You know, our observation, looking out at the world, our knowledge, our experience. What can we discover about the meaning of life from our own point of view? Assuming that this life is all there is. That's the position Ecclesiastes takes. And so it looks at all the different aspects of life, and the point that the book makes is that everything is meaningless. When you begin with yourself and examine life just from your own perspective, at best all that you can conclude is that this life is meaningless. And tonight we see the continuation of this argument that the book has been making. And the way that the teacher does it in this section is that he now stops to reflect on something that he's mentioned quite a few times in passing, but now he focuses in on it. And it's this experience that no one wants to have, and yet everyone eventually has it. It's this experience that none of us here have yet had it, but eventually we all will. It's the experience that as every second ticks by, we are moving closer toward it. What is it? Death. That's what this passage is all about. And the argument that the teacher makes here is that if this life is all there is, then death renders your life utterly meaningless in three different ways. And we're going to look at those three reasons. Three reasons why death renders your life utterly meaningless if this life is all there is. So let's have a look at these three things. The first reason is that death is certain. Death is certain. And that's you'll see that from verse 2 where he says, all share a common destiny. All share a common destiny. The righteous and the wicked, the good and the bad, the clean and the unclean, those who sacrifice and those who do not. Then he goes on to say, as it is with the good man, so with the sinner. As it is with those who take oaths, so those who are afraid to take them. All share a common destiny. Death is certain, he's saying. And so really, we're born into the world, we live our, 80 years, 80 or so years, and then that's it. It's guaranteed. It will end. And eventually our bodies will be lowered into the grave or burnt to ashes. And that's it for life as we know it in this world. It's absolutely certain. This is the world's one unavoidable fact, the one thing that no one can argue against or disprove, that we die. But there's something that the teacher wants us to really come to terms with, though, as we think about the certainty of death. And notice in verse 2 how he's emphasising that it doesn't matter how you live. It doesn't matter what sort of person you are in this life. Everyone ends up exactly the same. It doesn't matter if you are, Mother Teresa, for example, or Adolf Hitler. In the end, you both end up in exactly the same state. So even if you've spent your life helping the poor, doing good things, or you've spent your life oppressing the poor, doing bad things, ultimately, he says, everyone ends up in exactly the same state. And so from the perspective of under the sun, thinking that this life is all there is, that there's nothing beyond the grave, when you look at life from that perspective and you face the certainty of death, that it doesn't matter how you've lived, you die. It really looks like no matter what we do is absolutely fruitless, comes to nothing. And he says that, that's just wrong. It makes him angry. Have a look at verse 3. This is the evil in everything that happens under the sun. The same destiny overtakes all. It's an evil. He's saying this is like the ultimate injustice. That in the end, the death swallows up Every single person in exactly the same way. So just to help you get the point here, imagine you go into a cemetery and you come up to two graves next to each other. And in this grave over here on the left is buried a murderer. And then in the grave here in the right is buried the person who was murdered by that murderer. And as you look at those two graves, what do you see? Both are in exactly the same state. Neither has an advantage over the other. It's pretty grim to think about. But this is saying that if this life is all there is, then whether you're the murderer or the person murdered, in the end it makes no difference. And that's actually interesting to think about, because most people, even people who assume that this life is all there is, most people assume that there is some reward for living a good life. That if you do good in the world, that leads to something, that gives you some advantage in the long run. But if this life is all there is, the teacher is saying, then what is the reward? What is the worth of your deeds? If in the end you end up exactly the same as the worst person in history, what is the value of doing anything good? And people might say, well, it certainly makes a difference to those you help. Maybe. But what about when those people are dead? What does it amount to then? Nothing. So do you see the certainty of death? It actually means that if this life is all there is, if there is nothing beyond the grave, then death makes everything we do utterly meaningless. And that's the first point, that death is certain. Second thing that the teacher helps us to see here is that not only is death certain, but it's also final. It's final, and we see that in verses 4 to 10. And what he does, he contrasts in verses 4 to 10 between living and dying. And so have a look at verse 4, where he begins this point. He says, anyone who is among the living has hope. Even a live dog is better off than a dead lion. And so what he's saying there is, again, if this life is all there is, because need to get that into your mind, that's the perspective he's writing from. If this life is all there is, then the only hope that you have is confined to this life. And so even if your life is horrible, even if it's a miserable existence and it feels like it's not worth living, he's saying it's still better off than being dead. Because once you're dead, there is nothing from this perspective. And that's what the picture of the dog and the lion is all about. Now, I think the meaning kind of gets lost on us because when we read dog, live dog, we think of a little fluffy thing, that sits on your lap and you pat and it runs around the backyard. But the ancient people, like the teacher here, when they thought of dog, they thought scavenger. Dogs were, they were the mutts back then. That, run around, eating carcasses, rummaging through rubbish. If they had places where they would dump all their, dead stuff, that's where the dogs would be. And so the dog, it was a low life form. But notice what he's saying. Oh, and by the way, the lion in wisdom literature, like in Proverbs 30, verse 30, for example, the lion is the noblest of all creatures, the one to be respected. So the lion, the dirty mutt. But he's saying that the dog, because it's alive, even if it's the lowest life form, it's still better off than the lion that's dead. Because once you're dead, that's it. There is nothing. And he explains why in verses 5 to 6. So see there in verse 5, he says, "For the living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing. They have no further reward. Even the memory of them is forgotten. Their love, their hate, and their jealousy have long since vanished. Never again will they have part in anything that happens under the sun." So often you hear at funerals or perhaps when you watch a movie that when we lose a loved one, the idea is we can find great comfort in in the fact that they live on in our hearts. So they may not be here with us physically, but they continue on in our thoughts and in our memories. But what the teacher is saying in verses 5 to 6 there is that is not a real comfort at all. There's no comfort there, especially not for the person who is gone. Okay, what comfort does that person have if they're just a memory? It means nothing to them. And the other thing is, even the memory that we have of them is fading. And guess what? Once we die, even that memory will be gone forever, vanished. That's the word he uses there. Everything that the person does has vanished. And so when you die, you're gone forever. If this life is all there is, when you get to the end, nothing. It's final. It's irreversible. This is like a puddle drying up on a sunny day. It's gone. Death is final, and we're all heading straight for it. And in fact, if this life is all there is, then there's actually no comfort in death. None at all. There is no answer. There is no comfort. And, it's final, and therefore any comfort is only an illusion. This was brought out pretty clearly in an article that I read in The Age. It was written last year by someone who actually holds the perspective that the teacher is writing from, or the perspective that the teacher is investigating, the perspective that this life is all there is, that there's nothing beyond death. So the writer of this article in The Age holds that view, and so she was talking about how she handles death. And she was talking about how naive people are when it comes to handling death. And she talks about her own experience. So she said that when she was young, she lost her sister to a really long, drawn-out illness. It was a horrible experience. And then her sister died. And she said that people used to come up to her at that time and say to her, "It's okay. Your sister has gone to a better place." And she wrote that she knew that they were only trying to comfort her. She knew that they were only trying to help, but it had the opposite effect. It infuriated her. It made her so upset because, his sister was gone. And she actually wrote, "My late sister is not in a better place. The best place for her to be is here on earth, alive and healthy with us." And look, if there's nothing beyond the grave, then she's exactly right. That's right. But she actually didn't stop there. She went on to expose all of the sentiments that she is so sick of hearing. A lovely article, as you can imagine. And she mentioned this one. People say everything works out positively in the end. And she asks, okay, what is the positive end of a little girl dying? See, and she's being honest. But if you think about it, you can almost take that a little bit further. What positive end is there for anything if this life is all there is? If death is it, if it's final, and there's nothing beyond that, then there is no positive end for anything at all. There is essentially a nothingness. And when you put all this together, let's imagine we come from nothing and we go into nothingness in the future. So what is the worth of everything we do in between? Nothing. Everything is meaningless. Do you see the force of this argument that the teacher is making? It's all completely empty. It's all meaningless. In fact, when you read verses 7 to 10, he is talking about, our life. So, eat your food with gladness, drink your wine. Oh, joy. It's now that God favours what you do. Why? Because you're alive. Always be clothed in white. Always anoint your head with oil. Enjoy life with your wife, whom you love. And then he says, all the days of this meaningless life that God has given you under the sun. All your meaningless days. Notice how he's really emphasising it. If this life is all there is, and death is the end of it all, and that's it, then everything we do is meaningless. If there's nothing beyond the grave, then death really is final. So there you go, death is certain, it's final, and no one disputes that. But our problem is actually that we don't want to think about it. We kind of have a very funny position. Well, a lot of people do. People like to think that death is coming, but we assume, or it kind of feels like we're going to just be here forever. And so we don't have to worry about death. We can put that off. That will happen a long way into the future, or so it feels. But that's actually a mistake. And this is what the teacher goes on to tell us in verses 11 to 12. He reminds us in these verses that death is often sudden and unexpected. And so he begins to remind us of the randomness of life, where he writes that something else under the sun, the race is not to the swift, or the battle to the strong, nor does food come to the wise, or wealth to the brilliant, or favour to the learned, but time and chance happen to them all. So there's a snapshot of the randomness of life. Things just seem to happen randomly. There doesn't seem to be a reason behind the things that happen, and we talked about that last week. The swift should win the race, but sometimes they don't. The battle should go to the strong, but sometimes it doesn't. Or, wealth should go to the brilliant, but sometimes the brilliant stuck in a foreign land cleaning bathrooms or something like that. This life is so random. It doesn't go the way we expect it should go. But not only does life seem to be so random, but horrible things can just happen suddenly, unexpectedly, without any warning. And that's what verse 12 mentions. Moreover, no man knows when his hour will come. The hour of death. No one knows when it will come. He gives this little illustration. As fish are caught in a cruel net, or birds are taken in a snare, so men are trapped by evil times that fall unexpectedly on them. And so imagine those poor fish swimming around in the ocean, doing what fish love to do, and then all of a sudden, out of the blue, bang, this net comes down, gathers them all up, and before they know it, they're in a freezer. Or that bird happily pecking around, steps into this trap, bang, it's gone, off to the oven. And he's saying life is just like that. Suddenly, unexpectedly, the worst could happen. Even you watch the news, and every day you see that. You're seeing suddenly, unexpectedly, the worst could happen. And so I think it's nearly every single week on the news there is another shooting in schools in America. And you think about those poor children just going about their routine, they go to school and they get shot. Suddenly, unexpectedly, none of them were expecting that to happen. And, we watch the news and think, oh, that's all right, it's over there, it'll never happen in here, those silly Americans. But the thing is, every day these sort of things happen. Accidents, horrible things. And remember a couple of weeks ago, the one that stood out to me was these three grandmothers. I think it was three grandmothers. They're on their way home from a dance, in the car, going down the road, and then all of a sudden another car comes and smashes into the side of them. They're all dead, just like that, suddenly, unexpectedly. When I was in high school, my brother's best mate went out deer shooting with his dad, and his dad was tragically killed. And do you know how he was killed? A tree fell on him in the middle of a forest, millions of trees, and he happened to be standing in that one spot where this one tree in a million crushed him, suddenly, unexpectedly. That's what it says here. No one knows when his hour will come. Do you know, I once knew a fellow who was in the last few years of his working life, and he was completing a master's degree at the same time, and he had it all worked out that he was going to retire on the day that he finished his master's degree. And for those last few years, if you ever had a conversation with him, that's all he would talk about. He was obviously planning his retirement so carefully, and he'd always bring up, you're trying to chat about something else, he just wants to talk about retirement plans. And he was saying how he was going to write books, how he was going to travel the world, how he already had plans to build a house, and it all sounded really wonderful. But then tragically, it got down to, I think, the last few months before that retirement date, before the completion of that master's degree, and out of the blue he had this massive heart attack and he was gone, just like that, suddenly, unexpectedly. And there it is, no one knows when his hour will come. And this is all really grim to talk about, I know. But I'm talking about people I knew. And guess what? There's a reality there. And this is the thing. The reality is that every single one of us, as I said at the beginning, as every second ticks by, we are heading for our own death. It might be suddenly and unexpectedly, or it might not be suddenly and unexpectedly. It might be drawn out and given a date even. But either way, we're all going to die. And when you're forced to think about it in the way that the teacher is forcing us to think about in this passage, doesn't that put everything into perspective? Don't you realise that this is a big deal? We talk about what is the biggest issue that the world faces today? What is the biggest issue that we face today? And if you were to ask people on the street, they'll say things like global warming or pollution. People will talk about we need to fix poverty. We need to prevent nuclear war. All of these terrible things. And yeah, they're all big issues, but guess what? If this life is all there is, then even if we fix all of those things, in the end it matters for nothing. Do you know what the biggest issue this world faces? It's actually this question. Is this life all there is? That's the biggest issue this world faces, because if death is the end and there's nothing beyond the grave, then everything we do in this life counts for absolutely nothing. And so do you see what the teacher is doing? He's forcing us to face the logic of an assumption that so many live with, that this life is all there is. And if you live with that, then your life means nothing. Well, what's the answer then? What is the answer to the question of life? What is the answer to the question of death? What is the answer? Well, what answer does the teacher give us? And you'll notice that I've come to the end of the passage already. So what is the answer? Well, I think it's best to go and look again at verse 3. Because in verse 3, the teacher says, when he's talking about everyone dying, that this is the evil in everything that happens under the sun, that the same destiny overtakes all. Notice how he calls it an evil. Notice how he doesn't say this is the natural occurrence, that the same destiny overtakes all. See, why does he call death an evil? Think about life and death. Think about the world, the history of the world. What is the history of the world? It's a history of people getting born and dying. Okay? People have been dying for a long time now. And for many people, in our culture, the main assumption about death is that it's just a natural occurrence. Lots of people believe in an evolutionary cycle of the world, and evolution is built on death. Death is a necessary component of evolution. But here's the thing, if death is just a natural part of the world, then why get upset about it? Why call death an evil? Why not just call it a natural element? Why do we get upset? Why is it that when we think about our own death, we get upset? Or when we see someone else that we love die, why do we get upset? If it's just natural. It is an evil. And what the teacher is alluding to here is that in death there is a pointer. that when we look at death and we see the evil of it, that's actually a pointer that that is not the way this world was meant to be. That it's not a natural occurrence, that the world was not designed to include death. According to the Bible, death is more like an intrusion than a natural component. And so the Bible's view is actually, and we have looked at this in the last few weeks, but the Bible's view is that death was not part of the original creation, that when God made the world, it was perfect. There was no death. There was no suffering. That these things have actually come in as an intrusion, but why did they come in? Because of humanity's rejection of God. Because our first parents, Adam and Eve, decided that they didn't want to live under God's rule. They wanted to be the king of their own life. They rejected God, and the wages of sin, the Bible tells us, is death. That all of the stuff that, the world, it's broken, it's fallen, life is fallen. Our bodies are fallen. And death is the apex of that fallenness. That's what Romans 6:23 says. The wages of sin is death. That means that death is not a normal part of the world. It is an intrusion. It's something that's not meant to be here, and I know that you agree, we all feel that way, don't we? But the Bible actually does tell us what God has done about death. What has God done about it? Well, perhaps the best place to look is in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. I've got that for the screen tonight. This is where Paul is talking about believers who have died. And it's to the Thessalonians, so there's a church at Thessalonica, and they had some loved ones that had died, and they didn't know what happened to these people. Are they just gone? Is death the end? And what does Paul tell them? He says, brothers, we don't want you to be ignorant about those who fall asleep. Fall asleep is a euphemism for death, by the way. We don't want to grieve like the rest of men who have no hope. No, we believe that Jesus died and rose again, and so we believe that God will bring with Jesus those who have fallen asleep in him. See what Paul is saying there? He's saying that there is life beyond death. Death is not the end. There is hope beyond the grave, found in Jesus. And the big question is, though, well, how do we know that's true? How do we know that's not just wishful thinking? When Paul says there's life beyond the grave, how do we know he's not just selling, just happy thought? How do we know it's actually true? Well, notice what he says there. He says that this belief is not based on religion. This belief is not based on philosophy. It's not based on imagination. What is this belief based on? It's based on an historical event. Something happened 2,000 years ago that proves that life does not end at death. And what is that event? We believe that Jesus died and rose again. See, Jesus was crucified on a cross, which meant he was dead, dead as dead could be. He was buried, and 3 days later, he rose again. He rose again, and he promises that same resurrection to everyone who believes in him. See, to all who believe in Jesus, it's not just that you go to be in heaven when you die, but there's actually going to be a resurrection. We'll get our bodies back as they were originally designed to never die. That's the great hope that Jesus promises. And it's not just, wishful thinking. He proved it by rising from the dead himself. See, no one else makes the claim that Jesus did. And in light of everything we've looked at tonight, it would seem to me that there is no greater question for you to resolve in your own mind than this question: did Jesus really rise from the dead? Because if he did, then that proves everything. That's everything you need to know. The greatest question in the world is this life all there is? And according to Jesus, no. There's a whole eternity, but it's only in him. It's only when you believe in him that he gives that new life that goes on forever. Romans 6:23. Before I read only the first few words, the wages of sin is death, but you know what the rest of that verse is? The wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus. Amen. Let's pray.